Just when it seemed like the U.S. auto industry was going to recover from the Great Depression, bam, Pearl Harbor. As we entered the fat-fendered era, headlights were starting to become fully integrated into the bodies. At least among most American brands, freestanding headlights were becoming a thing of the past. But the U.S. auto industry was recovering, in spite of the war in Europe, and in some cases, probably because of it. Mainstream American vehicles were starting to be used in the war effort, perhaps not necessarily by us, but by other countries. But the U.S. military was looking for a very specialized vehicle, a quarter-ton general-purpose field car. And the car that really seemed to fit the bill was the American Bantam Blitz buggy. Fortunately, American Bantam was struggling just to survive and couldn't fill the military contract. So what they ended up with was the G503 Command Reconnaissance Vehicle, quarter-ton, four-wheel drive Jeep. Throughout the war, it would be produced by both Ford and Willys in huge numbers. In fact, once the U.S. did officially enter the war, production of regular vehicles ceased completely. Most American manufacturers continued to build things, just not for the general public. Not only were we pumping out Jeeps in a huge volume, but Dodge was making four-wheel drive power wagons as both trucks and ambulances. GM was also making trucks. Ford was working to produce Sherman tanks, and Packard aircraft engines. Of course, not every manufacturer was able to get these lucrative military contracts, and companies were continuing to fail. Not only did American Bantam close its doors, but so did Graham Page. But for nearly 3 years, there was essentially no American auto industry. Not only could you not buy a new vehicle during the war, it was hard to maintain your existing vehicle. Resources like steel and rubber were not readily available because they were reserved for the war effort. Recycling was becoming a thing, and maintaining your own vehicle. Something else that was scarce during the war was manpower. With so many soldiers away at the war, manufacturers were bringing in women to fill traditionally male-oriented jobs. So much so that the Cadillac assembly line was jokingly referred to as the Cadillac Red Light District. And of course, most of us are familiar with Rosie the Riveter and similar female promotional and marketing posters from the period. And this would also change how cars would be marketed after the war. And when production did kick back up after the war in 1946, production would basically start exactly where it left off a few years before. There wasn't really a display of all new models. One of the earliest exceptions to that was Kaiser Frazer. Kaiser Frazer was built off of the bones of Graham Page and introduced an all-new car with aircraft-inspired styling. It seemed so far ahead of the major American manufacturers that it was called the post-war wonder. And soon all the major American manufacturers were pushing forward to introduce new products with new styling to catch up. The fenderless look was in, but buyers tended to be conservative after the war, and the more radical the new styling was, the less likely it would appeal to them. Some of the new replacement designs even ended up acquiring some unfortunate nicknames, such as the Nash upside-down bathtub or the Packard pregnant elephant. Another manufacturer that would come out of nowhere and have an impact on the industry was Tucker. Tucker was a one-year-only limited production model, but it essentially forced the industry to take a look at safety concerns. Things like padded dashboards, seat belts, pop-out windshields, and, of course, the center headlight that turned with the steering wheel. Now, only 50 of these cars were made, but they still managed to have a pretty profound impact on what was to come in the American auto industry. They even made a feature-length film about him called Tucker, A Man in His Dream, something you may want to check out. Unlike most manufacturers, Willys was in no position to go back to where they left off. They were geared up solely for Jeeps, so they just continued to make Jeeps for the public, civilian Jeeps, or CJs as they would come to be known. In fact, instead of going on to develop a car to replace the Jeep, they ended up developing Jeep-based vehicles, the Jeepster Phaeton, a Jeep pickup, and a wagon based on it. Something else that changed the way we viewed the market were hot rods. Hot rodding is essentially home-done performance. It's the traditional version of tuning. Any number of ways you could try to improve the performance of your classic vehicle. Engine swaps and engine modifications were very common. Lowering the center of gravity, so not only lowering the suspension, but channeling the body, chopping the top, reducing weight by taking off parts that were unnecessary, and of course, wider tires. Typically, engine modifications included the 3 C's and E: cam, carburation, compression, exhaust. Not surprisingly, hot rodding evolved into motorsports. Motorsports in 2 distinct different fashions, one of which, of course, is drag racing, competitive acceleration. The other motorsport later became known as stock car racing, similar to other endurance-type racings of the period, but more based around factory vehicles. A motorsport that, to at least some degree, evolved from Prohibition-era moonshine runners. But overall, it was just people with hot rods trying to prove whose was faster. And what was happening after the war is manufacturers were starting to see how these motorsports appealed to people. And what was born out of this was sort of the factory hot rod. One of the first cars to do this was Oldsmobile. They essentially took their mid-priced Model 86 and dropped the V8 from their bigger 98 into it to call it the 88 Rocket. Some people will even go so far as to call this one of the first muscle cars. And what this would lead to is a horsepower war that would continue on through the 1950s. And we will come back to that in our next video.